So kicking off this afternoon is Rabin from Center for Creative Leadership. This is a center that I've long been aware of and have tremendous respect for the kind of work they're doing. And Ron is going to ask and I guess answer the question, can technology make learning stickier?
Thank you. So I work for the Center for Creative Leadership, or CCL, and at CCL we focus exclusively on executive education and leadership development training, and a particular aspect of that, which I'll, for lack of a better term, call soft skills. So we don't teach business acumen, we don't do marketing, we don't do financial training. We focus exclusively on things like how to help people create a vision, how to foster an environment of innovation, how to hold difficult conversations with direct reports. And these are all skills, soft skills, that are very, very difficult to make stick in the workplace. So I'm going to argue today that really this is leadership development's greatest challenge, is to achieve behavior change. So we have very happy and, I would say, successful programs. I've had a number of people today come up to me and say, oh, you're at CCL. I took one of your programs, Leadership Development Program or Leadership at the Peak Program. Love the program. We get great reviews. We have wonderful experiences. We get 4.8, 5.0 reviews. But the question that I always ask is, what is the impact of our programs? So new learning is fragile. People often fall back on their old habits. And 2 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, 6 months after training, how much of what we've actually trained people to do is actually being implemented in the workplace, right? This is always the challenge that we face. So this is not just a problem for CCL, of course. This is a problem, I think, that anyone who works with soft skills has to face. And this is known as the transfer problem or transfer of training. But, since I'm not a human resource development researcher, and I don't really like the term transfer of training, I'm just going to call it stickiness, or the sticky problem today. But it's certainly something that we all have to deal with. And it's really a simple problem. If this is our learner, there are two things we have to think about. One is, how do we get information into the learner's head, right? And how does it come out again, right? And getting it in is things that we think about all the time. How do we train people effectively? How do we make the information interesting, right? How do we make them retain it when they walk out the door? And the other part is, how do we get the behavior change? How do we create the triggers so that when they're back in the workplace, they can actually retain the information, they can actually pull it out of their head and use it? How can they make it actionable? And the first part of that equation, how do we get the information in? I would say facilitators, instructional designers are pretty good at that. We've had a lot of training, we can figure out how to do that. The other part, how to get it out, that's challenging. And that's not something that a lot of us have been trained to do. We often rely on our learners to do that, to figure out, okay, here I am back in the workplace. I have to figure out how to recall what I did, how to make it effective, how to make it actionable. But really, it should be part of our job, because if it's not something that can be acted upon, then a lot of the learning's been wasted. So this is a problem that I think that we all face, the transfer problem or the stickiness problem. There's been a lot of research into this issue. And does anyone know, about every 8-10 years or so, there's another sort of meta-study that looks at all the studies that have been done about kind of the transfer problem and tries to figure out, okay, how much of what people actually learn in a classroom or some kind of instructor-based training, or even other types of learning like e-learning or blended learning, doesn't really matter, but some type of training, how much of that is actually impactful after, after, let's say, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months back on the job? Does anyone have an idea about what percentage of training is actually being utilized in the workplace?
Well, I don't know if that's there. From an ROI perspective, I think that's something like 10%. Is that
Okay, 10%. Anyone else have a guess? 5%? Anyone else? Those are good guesses. Usually about 5 to 15% is the figure that's given, and that's been pretty stable over about 10, 20, 30 years. Very hard to estimate. It's also hard sometimes comparing apples and oranges. What does percentage mean? Does that mean everybody who goes to training remembers 15% of what they learned? Does it mean 15% of the people remember a lot of, so it's not always comparable what that means. And maybe it's okay sometimes if people remember 15%. If it's 15%, that's the actual 15% that's actionable, that's important to them. But when you think about it, you think about what you're actually teaching in the classroom or in blended or whatever, you think about the 80 or 85% that people are not retaining. That's a lot of wasted effort, right? So it's not just a problem for CCL. I think it's a problem for all of us. So as I said, there's been a lot of research on this question. Like a lot of research, this is my problem with researchers, really good at identifying the causes of this, not so great about telling us what to do about it and how to be more effective. A lot of sort of case studies in our organization. Here are the problems that we had. Here's kind of a thing that we might try, and a future study might tell us why this might help, but not so great about telling us, actual techniques that we can use. But what I want to do before sharing with you some of the research, I want each of you at your table groups just take 5 minutes and share with one another what your experiences are, either directly with your students, if you have students you've been working with people, or your own personal experiences about translating some of what you've learned back into your work environments and some of the obstacles that you've had. So just take a few minutes to think about, why haven't I been able to implement what I've learned, or when I'm teaching people in my own training, my career as someone who's involved with training, why haven't people been able to implement that? So let's take 5 minutes to do that, and then I'll share with you some of what research has to tell us about it. Let's take a look on some of the research and see if any of these came up in your discussions. Anyone talk about the learners? Issues with the learners? Someone have one they want to share with us? Obstacles related to the learners themselves? Yeah.
Well, I think we did, and we kind of talked about a couple of observations by several of us who said that actually getting people involved in what ultimately you want them to do is key. Just telling them about it doesn't usually cut it. Yeah.
So learner involvement, making sure that they're really part of the training.
And they actually get to try out what it is that what you're talking about. Yeah.
Great. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about it, you talk about personal development. I think we're so used to clichéness that we forget to make it personal, right? And so the learner, and how do you understand motivational factors and tie that to what motivates either them and their organization, or them, obviously if you can make it to them personally, and how that learning mode then becomes an emotional and not just rational checkbox attachment becomes obviously very critical.
Good. Anyone else? A big factor in the research, having the wrong learners in the course, right? Not even, instruction's not good, the learners are, not engaged, but just, these aren't the right people, they shouldn't be in this course, right? Big issue. Anyone about the job itself? Yeah?
We talked about the concept of atrophy, and the fact that training has a very short shelf life, and it's not going to be practice. And so if you're training stuff that cannot be applied to the job very quickly,
right.
Either the learner shouldn't be there, as you point out, or you're training the wrong things.
Exactly. That's a key.
Sometimes on the learning side, I'll speak to my learning hat, you kind of drink your own Kool-Aid. You get excited about the latest buzz or something, but if it's not aligned with the organization and the organization's ready to accept it, you really have to take a step back and understand what impact you have to try to do.
Right. Great. Yeah.
And I think connecting those two together, there can be content overload. I think oftentimes what happens is that there's some really good content. So it is matching the learner to the job. But then it gets to the point that I would think that literally you can suck the life out of what you already learned. Right? That's the way you had it, and then it just by the time you're on it,
And that gets into instruction. So there's some overlap, obviously, the categories. But yeah, anyone else on a job-related one, or another big one with the job, not related to the good training, right people, really not quite related to the job. Maybe that's related to what you were saying. It's not applicable right now, but some disconnect between what you're training me to do and what my job calls for, right? So around the requirements of the training and the job. Yeah.
I just thought of this now. We didn't really talk about this one as much, but it's not a good point. Sometimes measuring, sometimes assessing culture is the first thing you do for your training. See how actually there are, little fewer activities in there. So that's another thing that can make it lazy, as well too.
Absolutely. We'll get into that in a minute in system. Anyone talk about the manager? role of the manager? Didn't come up, huh?
Yeah, we did.
Manager's really critical, right? So what a lot of the research tells me is, or tells us, is that person goes in, they get trained, they come back to the workplace ready to do something. Manager says, nah, I don't want you to do it that way. That's not how we do things here. You don't have time to do that. I'm not going to support you in doing it that way. And person falls back on old habits, right? Hard to overestimate the importance of the manager. Instruction itself. Anyone talk about that? We alluded to that a little bit earlier, right? Making sure the person's involved, the learner's involved in the way that the class is. So other things that the research tells about the instruction. Instruction's boring. It's too much information overload, right? Instruction itself could be effective. And under system, I mean, system's kind of a broad word, but I would say culture, right? So anything having to do with culture. Culture doesn't support this. The reward system doesn't support this, right? That's also a big one. Okay.
I want to go back to the comment that was made before, because real learning doesn't take place up here. It takes place in here. It's reaching people where they live, as we talked about here, in the heart. And that's transformation. That's when people begin to hold on to it. I don't know if anybody this morning, when you're watching one of the videos with the older gentleman and the young colleague, when they shook hands, did anybody here feel an ounce of emotion when they did that? That's transformation. Right? That's a moment there. So we have to find ways to try and reach people in a way that stays with them. That's the stickiness is in here. We think we're teaching them. There's a lot of noise that comes out of these things, but there's very little wisdom. And so that manager-learner relationship becomes very important. And the other observation I'd make is about corporate culture, because all studies indicate the single biggest determinant of behavior in organizations is culture. And so you can teach people something outside the culture, but as soon as they go back into the culture, it transforms them back into the systems that exist there. So we need to understand the power of culture.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. I want to talk about one solution to approaching the stickiness problem. And so at CCL, a lot of what we do are open enrollment courses. So that means that we offer courses that have participants from all different organizations. And much as I'd love to tackle the issue of culture and reward systems, much as I'd like to tackle the issue of people's managers and incorporating that into what we do, that's sometimes outside the bounds of what we can do. So what I'm going to propose today is something that is within the scope of what we can do, and I think what anyone here in the room can do. And that has to do with three aspects: the learner, the content, and the message. And I'm going to use just a really simple metaphor to think about this. If you want something to be sticky, you can think about it as putting a piece of paper on the wall, right? There are kind of three elements. There's the wall itself. You have to prepare the wall, right? Make sure it's clean and can receive the paper. There's the paper itself. Can't be too heavy. Has to be the right size. And then there's the fastener, right? There's the glue or the tape or whatever. Has to be sticky enough. Maybe you need it to be not so sticky that you can't kind of reposition the paper later on without tearing it. And so in this little simple analogy, the wall's the learner, the piece of paper's the content, and the fastener's the message, right? And there's a real importance in the difference between the content and the message. They're very different. The content is what you are going to select to include in your instruction or your training, right? What's important? What do I want to focus on? The message is how you're going to get that across in a way that's going to be memorable, that your learner is actually going to retain. So my example of this is movie popcorn, right? So movie popcorn, one interesting fact, piece of content about movie popcorn, or at least until recently, is that movie popcorn contains a lot of saturated fat, right? It's about 37 grams of saturated fat. So you can tell people that. You can say, okay, did you know movie popcorn contains 37 grams of saturated fat? That's a lot of saturated fat. That's more saturated fat than you should have in an entire day. Okay, it's a piece of content. Are people going to remember that? Probably not. Or you can say, movie popcorn contains more saturated fat than, you can actually put it differently. You can say it contains more artery clogging fat than a bacon and eggs breakfast plus a Big Mac plus a steak dinner combined, right? Now that's a sticky message. That's not just content. That's something sticky that people are actually going to remember. And that was the basis for a campaign to get rid of the way that movie popcorn is sold in movie theaters that actually convinced people to actually change what they were doing. So that's the difference between content and message, right? You can just decide what's going to go into your course and it's going to contain this or that, but you also have to figure out how you're going to do it in a way that people are going to remember it, retain it, and be able to pull that information later on. So what I want to do today in the time we have left is talk about some technology solutions for making things sticky. And the reason I'm giving you this framework is because you have a lot of technology options out there, right? There's cell phones, there's iPads, there's Second Life, there are games, simulations, and we've seen some examples today. And I'm a technologist. I love playing with this stuff. It's really fun, right? Every year, every 2 months, there's some new solution. But I always have to ask myself, how are we using this? How are we going to make this effective? And this is kind of my test, right? If the technology is not being used in a way that's going to make the content stickier, if our learners are not going to walk out the door and be able to not only retain this, but able to use it back in the workplace, then why are we using this technology, right? It might be fun. It might offer them a little bit of interest in the classroom or beyond the classroom. But if it's not really being used in the service of making the content stickier, then maybe it's a waste of time. And I don't really want to waste my time. I only have a certain amount of things that I can do with the budget and the amount of time that I have allocated to me. So I'm proposing this kind of stickiness framework for you as you think about how you can start to use technology. And just about all the solutions I'm going to propose to you today are, I wouldn't say they're low-tech, but they're inexpensive solutions, right? I don't have a huge budget. I try to do things pretty quickly. And I always try to find things that I think are going to help deal with the stickiness question. So before I start to move into some examples, any questions about the framework I presented so far? My goal really is just to share some examples and get a little bit of a dialogue. So let's start with the learner. So as you think about your learner, there's sort of 4 things to consider. And this is it's like very basic learning theory. I'm not very interested in learning theory. But it's interesting and useful to think about this. This is from Malcolm Knowles, who's kind of like the grandfather of learning theorists. If you have a favorite learning theorist, probably incorporating some of this. So readiness, experience, autonomy, and action. So your learners have to be ready to learn, right? This is kind of the vessel theory. You can't just pour water into a vessel that's turned upside down. They're not ready to receive what you have to give them, no matter how interesting and how important you think your content is. If your learner is not ready to receive it, it's just not going to be retained. So readiness means you have to convince them that what you're giving them is a value of some kind. And that could be, it's going to make their job easier. It's going to make them more effective. It's going to lead to some developmental goal that they have. It's going to make them more successful. But you have to convince them of that before they're going to be ready to learn from you. The second is experience, and that means you have to respect the experience that your learners are coming into the classroom with. Right? All of your learners have had some experience, even if they're undergraduates. And the more that you can tap into that experience and connect with it and build on it, the more that your learners are going to respect what you have to say. The third is autonomy. So adult learners tend to be very autonomous. And we've talked about this, and people have alluded to it earlier. The more that you can let them discover the learning on their own, build their own models, the more they'll be convinced of what they learn. So examples of that are, instead of presenting them with a way of doing things, let them figure it out on their own. They'll be much more convinced of it. They're much more willing and ready to retain that information if they've constructed it on their own rather than they've just had it presented to them. And try to give them as many options as possible, both in the classroom and beyond the classroom. And then finally, action. This is what I alluded to earlier. You have to give them ways of acting on the knowledge that you provided. You can't just say, here's great information, up to you to figure out what the triggers are, up to you to figure out how to act on that. You have to give them job aids and templates and checklists and all the rest of that will help them actually act on that knowledge. Okay, so let's get into some actual examples. So one way to shape the learner's attitude, which we can define as the readiness in both their experience, going into training, is to have a debate. And we talked about this earlier also. I know a lot of you do debates and you have case studies and scenarios and all that in the classroom. What I'm advocating here, do this before your training begins. Do this as pre-work. Get them thinking about some of the issues that you're going to talk about in the classroom before your training formally begins. And one way to do that is with some social media tools. You can do this with Twitter. If you want to do it in kind of short bursts, you can do it with a blogging tool like Blogger. A lot of these are free. If you want to have them kind of post or talk about it in more depth, or Ning or Facebook or wherever your learners are at, it doesn't really matter what the tool is. But get them talking, thinking about something that they have experience in, that they have some passion behind before they start. It's really important. So one of the advantages of that is if you do the debate in the classroom, Some of the problems is what? You'll have probably a few people who are going to dominate the discussion. The instruction has already begun, so you're taking up classroom time doing that, whereas if you do it beforehand, first of all, everyone's going to contribute equally. You're going to make sure everyone contributes equally. That's one of the advantages of social media. Everybody is probably more likely to contribute rather than having it dominated by a few people. And also, you can take a little bit of the temperature of the class based on what kind of responses you get. You can have some experience of, some understanding of what are the experiences of these people, how can I start to adjust the content perhaps a little bit based on their responses. And you can also start the very first, if it's class or the very first instruction or whatever it is, based on what kind of dialogue have we had on this debate. And you can start to connect from the very beginning of your instruction, how am I going to convince these people that based on their experiences, I have something useful to give them, right? And I'm not sure what the content is, but based on this discussion, maybe the dilemma or the case I gave you, there's no easy answer. But what we can do in this class is give you some tools to make it easier, to give you some guidance. So I'm advocating thinking about some of these social media tools to get some of this discussion and thinking started before the class actually begins. It'll be great to get the learner's attitude, their head around this idea that, hey, this has something to offer, it's going to respect my experience with this content. It's also going to give you some information about your learners. So thinking about the second bubble, autonomy, giving the learners more autonomy in the classroom. It's really challenging with our programs. Some of them are just 2 days of classroom time. Our longest program is about 4.5 days. And we usually have a lot of information that we want to get across. This is an overview of a coaching curriculum. So we do a lot of coaching. We have, I think, about 3 or 4 different fairly sophisticated coaching programs. And the problem is we have so much information to give. And our instructors, you know, I think maybe you've had the experience too, the most efficient way of getting information across is to lecture, right? So in our coaching program, we want to coach people on how to have a difficult conversation with a report, how to have a developmental conversation with a report. We have a coaching framework we want to get across. We have how to give feedback and probably 2 or 3 other things. And we have to do that in 2 days of face-to-face. But we also have great coaches, and we have a lot of video equipment, and we want to have the opportunity to actually have people practice in the classroom and see what they're doing wrong and give them feedback and, you know, play the tape and all that. Very hard to do all that in 2 days. So what we're experimenting with is how much of that can you offload before the class, actually have them do some of the basic skills training before the class through e-learning, have some practice even before the class, and then save the class time itself for the coaching, for sort of the face-to-face interaction and guidance. So, so very quickly, this is kind of a simplification, but if you wanted to do something on difficult conversations and developmental conversations, you don't have a whole lot of classroom time. You can do some of the training through e-learning, right? Present the model, give some examples. That could be e-learning, it could be through video. You can actually have a virtual classroom where they practice some of these skills, maybe through role plays with their peers. Maybe you have a, you know, breakout sessions in your virtual classroom with a coach that kind of steps in and sort of gives them a bit of guidance, but it's virtual classroom stuff. And then you give them an assignment. You say, try this out in the workplace. You just learned a great new technique for having a developmental conversation. You just learned a great new technique for giving feedback. Try it out in the workplace and see what it's like and think about, is it effective or not? Are you comfortable with it? And then you come to the class. And you're going to start this conversation at a much higher level because you've actually built some of the skills, you've tried them out, you've decided whether they're effective or not. Oh, and by the way, in the class, now we don't have to go through all these different things. You can actually pick what you want to build on. If you think in your particular job you really need to work with difficult conversations, developmental conversations not so important to you, you can spend the whole 2 days on being coached just on difficult conversations. Or vice versa, you can pick developmental. So you give the learner a lot more choice because you've covered the basics, you kind of offloaded it from the class. Is anyone familiar with the Khan Academy? It's been in the news quite a bit. So yeah, so this is kind of a similar technique to, so the Khan Academy is, what they do is this is a way of teaching high school, I guess it's mostly high school, maybe it's junior high school too, high school students math and science skills, and it's all through videos that you can watch on YouTube. And the technique is you watch the videos on YouTube and it teaches you about algebra or other types of science. And you learn that you learn them by watching the videos, and then you go into the class with your questions about oh, I couldn't quite figure this out, and the teacher helps you, but you've learned the basic skills ahead of time. So the classroom time is really reserved for coaching, not so much for kind of the teaching. So it's kind of a similar technique to this. So some other tools to make your learners a bit more autonomous, to give them more choice. We're starting to experiment with using iPads in the classroom now. I was sort of not so convinced these are the greatest things, but now I'm starting to be convinced by a bit more. We actually distribute them at the start of class. We're using them in our 4.5-day program, and then we collect them at the end. People aren't so thrilled when we collect them. But here are some of the things that we're trying, and you know, you can create your own apps, right? It's expensive to build your own apps. It's like, could be $5,000, $15,000. These are all like available apps, like $5, $10. But some things that you can think about using. So instant polling, everybody has a polling device, right, on their machine. And you can start to think about how do we get instant feedback on something that we're doing in the class. So we use these for when we play video clips. We have video clips when we talk about influence tactics. And we play a video clip from a Hollywood movie that demonstrates an influence tactic when we ask people to vote on which tactic do you think this was. And it's not always easy because sometimes it's a blend of different ones. And so you immediately see the bar chart, and that can be sort of a discussion point. Or you can have free polls. You can ask an open-ended question like, you know, what's your biggest challenge as an individual contributor, and sort of share the results. Say it was an interesting half the class has a challenge with this or that. Let's talk about that. Mind mapping, I don't know how many people use mind mapping. It can be a very powerful tool. A lot of our clients aren't so familiar with it, but then they kind of walk away and say, wow, that was really powerful. So if you're building a model of something or a problem-solving technique, it can be really useful to kind of build it visually. And the iPads are great for this. Not so great to have the laptops, because laptops tend to be kind of individual devices. When you have an iPad on a table, it's much easier to kind of share and pass around and collaborate. So I just give one example of a mind mapping tool. There are lots of different mind mapping tools for tablets. Collaborative note-taking. So we used to have people, when they needed to brainstorm, come up and do it on a flip chart, do it with Post-it notes. So it takes a while. They have to come up and put the things on. You can do this really quickly with some of these note-taking. Evernote and some of the other ones that have collaborative notebooks. So you have one big notebook. Everybody's kind of contributing at the same time, and it gets projected at the front of the screen. So very quickly you can build a brainstorm on something, and everyone sees the results. And finally, storyboarding. We do a lot with visual tools, but most of them are static, right? So we use visual, like images as metaphors to get people thinking in terms of right brain, which is really great, really powerful. But we haven't done much with narrative. So strip designers, it's almost like a cartoon kind of thing where you take images and you put them together to tell a story. So that's also a really powerful technique. Start to get your clients thinking about how do I create a narrative out of something, and that can be really useful as well. So again, these are all readily available $5, $10 apps that you can start to use in the classroom. Yeah.
What's the name of the instant polling one?
There are a number of them. The one that we use is called Poll Everywhere. Yeah. And Poll Everywhere is available for all different, you can use it on iPads, on mobile phones, even on dumb phones. You can use it through instant messaging. People can contribute. Dumb phones, yeah. So I'm still thinking about the learner. So what can we do sort of post-training? So the simplest thing really is, I don't know how many people use Twitter or microblogging. So after people are done with the class, really, really simple. You send out a tweet and you say, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks after the program, how is it going? What's working? What was the most effective thing you learned? What are you struggling with? What kind of follow-up can we do that can best support you? And you try to get a little bit of discussion going, right? Very simple, costs almost nothing, but kind of encourages that feedback loop, gets people out of kind of the LMS, have to log into one central system mindset. Is something really lightweight. And if your users or your learners aren't on using Twitter, then figure out where they're on. If they're on some corporate system, some place that they're going to see it, right? If they're on Facebook, then do it through Facebook. But something that keeps them connected, where you can just kind of poll your learners about, well, are you using this stuff? Is it effective? What's the best thing that you learned? Very simple, low-cost way of doing that. Related to that is QStream, which is a commercial product, although kind of the basic version is free. QStream's a way of asking questions. instantly through you can do it through mobile devices like cell phones. So you can do this during your class, or if it's like a 6-month class with intercession, during the breaks, you can ask questions, right? You can ask provocative questions, or you can test people on their knowledge of what they learned in the classroom. And then you get kind of like a dashboard of how people are responding, how many people got it right or didn't get it right. So that's another great way of just, what are people learning? What are they retaining? What are they struggling with? And then finally, Group Talk. Group Talk is an app that we wrote, actually fairly low cost, that we wrote for India. So in India, at least the parts in India that we're working with, a lot of people don't have good internet connections, but they rely on their mobile devices almost exclusively. So we wrote an app that keeps people, it's kind of similar to the other solutions like I mentioned with Twitter, so that after a program, we could ask people what's working, what's effective, but it also as a discussion forum, so people can kind of talk to one another and offer each other advice about some of the things that they're encountering and what they're struggling with. But again, on their mobile phones, because that's where this particular cohort lives. And we know that if we send out information that way, they're all going to respond and connect with one another. So it's really dependent on your learners and where they're at and what they're going to respond to. That's the last one. Any questions about some of the learner-centered tools? And then I'll talk about some related to content. Okay. I'll go through the next ones quickly, and I'm just giving you the high sign. So around content, one thing to think about is a course necessary, right? Always a really good question. Does this have to be a course, right? I'm an instructional designer. This is what I do for a living. I love giving courses, but sometimes you don't really need a course. So sometimes what's useful, if the problem is getting the content closer to the job, is don't do a course, do a job aid, right? So this is an example of what Kathy Moore calls a mega job aid. And so when you think of job aids, you think of simple things like, oh, it's a checklist or it's a template or something. But you can actually build something pretty sophisticated. I don't know how well you can see, but this is this is what she calls an e-learning blueprint, which is built for instructional designers. So kind of over on the left here, there's a navigation that kind of walks you through the steps of designing an e-learning. So that's not all that interesting. But what is interesting is embedded in this is all different kinds of things. So embedded in this are different tools, templates, also discussion. So other people have used this, can kind of comment on what they've done, what's been successful, what works well. So actually instead of building an e-learning course on something that people need to do, think about, maybe I need to build a course that tells them how to use a job aid, and then most of the time they're using the job aid, right? So if you use a job aid to get something done, then your transfer problem disappears. Now you don't have to worry about remembering what I learned and using it in the workplace. Now I'm actually using the tool in the workplace, and my transfer problem has gone away, especially if the tool is sophisticated enough that people would want to use it on a regular basis. Another thing you can think about is if people are only going to want to retain a certain amount of content, right? So they're not going to get 90 or 95% of what you deliver, maybe it's 15 or 20% if you're lucky, then make sure you chunk your content with that in mind. So this is a class that we developed called Managing Global and Virtual Teams, right? That's a huge, messy topic. That's about teams and global, cultural issues and virtual teams and technology and all that kind of stuff. And it's 5 modules, it's like 5 hours, it's an e-learning course. So what we tried to do is to make it as chunkable as possible. We did it in 5 modules, and we really tried to give the learner who's taking an e-learning course as much guidance as possible as to what's in each of these parts, what are you going to learn in each one, and by the way, you don't really need to work through each one to get what you need. If you're managing a global and virtual team, and your problem is really around trust and relation building on the team, we're not going to force you to go through the ones on culture and team learning. Yeah, maybe you have some cultural issues, but you can just jump to the part that you need. So make sure that when you think about your learning, make it as chunkable as possible so that maybe if they're only going to get 15 or 20%, that's okay because it's the 15 or 20% that they really need. And then finally, let me get to the stickiness part. So there's a great book called Made to Stick. Has anyone read that? Yeah, it's a really fun book, actually, but it has a lot of great information in it, too. So the Heath brothers have written this book called Made to Stick, and here are the 6 things that they think make for stickiness in ideas, urban myths, legends, and so on. And so there are kind of 4 of these that I think we can really tap into. So stories, emotions, and credibility. And my recipe for these is videos, right? And so I'm kind of preaching to the converted, I think, because we've seen the use of videos. I think videos are really powerful. Unfortunately, they can be really expensive, as we know, but not so bad if you think about repurposing them, right? So what we do is we create a video for e-learning, and then you can use it in the classroom, right, as a basis for discussion. Videos work really well cross-platform on phones. So you create one video, and then you can push it out as a performance support tool across Android and iPhone and all the other phone platforms too. But to do an effective video, it has to be done well, right? You got to use real actors, not Ed down the hall who took acting in college. You got to get good actors because you got to get the emotions across, right? So I want to give you one quick example. This is from our Managing Global and Virtual Teams modules that I mentioned before. And each of these modules opens with a video story, and each of them opens with a failure, right? And we saw this technique earlier today. Very powerful way of getting people to pay attention to your message is showing what happens if they don't lead effectively. Getting across some of the emotion, the frustration people have when you're not doing your job well.
It's great that we're here today so we can get started on this new initiative. We'll have one more team member home and joining us later in the week, but I didn't want to wait to get started. As the team lead, I know from past experience we'll have some challenges given the cultural diversity of the team and the fact that we're scattered around the globe. But I know we'll overcome those issues to do our best work together. Mika, team, this is Cynthia. I'm also very glad that we're meeting like this.
I was about to send you all an email.
Obviously, Cynthia is very enthusiastic, but I feel like she's overstepping her bounds. She should defer to Mika to guide this discussion. Mika's the team lead after all.
I don't even know these people. I know this initiative is important, but couldn't we spend some time in our first meeting getting a little more familiar with one another? It's strange just to get started like this, talking about the project details without knowing anything about our colleagues. It's not the way I'm used to working.
Roadblocks, but I came up with the best solution. I knew that if we just continue to do this, and if we continue to go down this road as opposed to that road, then we wouldn't hit these roadblocks as much anymore. Do you see what I'm saying?
Great idea, Cynthia. I'd like to see more about your project. Please be sure to forward the report to the team. Let's keep the momentum going. Anyone else have ideas about the project?
Hello, this is Sanjeev. I'm also excited to get started. Cynthia, I read the report from the team you mentioned. I think as well that there are many things that we can take from that experience. But you must acknowledge that your team was inefficient in trying so many solutions when the fix was obvious. We don't have that time to go down so many wrong paths at this point.
Well, as you know from the report, Sanjeev, we were charged.
This argument is making me so confused. Cynthia and Sanjeev seem to hate one another. I don't know how we'll be able to work with so much animosity. Why doesn't Mika step in to get things back on track? And shouldn't there be a clear agenda? This seems like a waste of time.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I'm not trying. This is unbelievable. I'm up at 5 a.m. We have no agenda. I still don't know who the rest of the team is. These two are arguing and dominating the conversation, and it's 5 a.m. I have other project responsibilities that will keep me up all night. This is definitely not the way I wanted to start my day. Yeah, but the bottom line is...
Well, clearly there is no reason for me to stay on this call. Cynthia?
So definitely tapping into emotion stories and also credibility, right? So the difference really between having a CEO give a message and actually having people that your learner can identify because it mirrors some of the experiences that maybe they've had. And then here's my final one, unexpectedness. That's one of the sticky qualities. So if you've ever stuck with a movie, even though it wasn't such a great movie because you really wanted to figure out what happens to the characters, or you've read a nonfiction book about something that really is not something you think you'd be interested in, but the way it was told was so compelling that you just had to figure out kind of what the next step was, or sort of how it unfolded, right? Very, very compelling technique. This is called kind of the gap theory, and it's a way that good writers and good screenwriters operate. They tell things like a mystery story, so you have to kind of know what the next piece of the puzzle is. And this can be a really powerful technique that you can use to keep your learners connected. So it's an important part of stickiness, not just to sort of surprise them with something unexpected, but to keep them connected with your learning. So one example is if you want to teach a course on art history, right, you could give them a lot of facts about different artists, or you could set it up like a mystery story. You can give them a painting and say, here's a mystery painting, you go figure out who painted it. Here are some clues in the painting, and here's some research volumes you can go in, and you play the role of an art detective, or you play the role of this type of detective or that type of detective. And you can use technology in some way, some interesting way, to do your research and to give them enough clues to kind of get them hooked, but put them in the role of a practitioner, put them in the role of an expert, and then give them just enough clues to kind of hook them so that they want to figure out what the answer is. Very effective technique for keeping them engaged with the learning, but also building that expertise so that they're actually going to remember it when they leave the door. So that's the end of my presentation. I think this is a useful framework, as I mentioned, that I always think about when I'm trying to incorporate technology into a learning solution. I love using technology. I just want to make sure that it has a sound educational, pedagogical value. And here are some suggestions for further reading. Any other questions? I know we're just about out of time. No questions? Thank you. Thanks.